You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. On today's programme, as global temperatures tick up, scientists warn a key limit could be reached in the next 5 years. The Gulf state reliant on oil but at risk from climate change. We speak to Bahrain's climate envoy. And a plea to leave nothing but footprints behind if you're visiting the UK's beaches this half-term. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show where we track the changes happening to our world right now and meet those developing the solutions. Coming up, the species of giant tortoise rediscovered on the Galapagos Islands after 100 years. But first, let's go straight over to our data dashboard and take a look at this number here. Now, this is an estimate of how much humans have warmed our planet since the Industrial Revolution, and you can see it's ticking up every single second. Now, the aim agreed by 196 parties in the Paris Accord of 2015 is to keep that number below 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5 degrees of warming. Because above that, we could see more extreme weather, higher sea levels, more people forced from their homes, and more climate-related disasters. But scientists are warning today there's a 40% chance that we'll temporarily hit 1.5 degrees in at least one of the next 5 years. And these odds are increasing all the time, according to the World Meteorological Organization. Well, with me now is Max Dilley, who's Climate Programme Director at the World Meteorological Organization. Hello to you. How much of a concern is it if the temperature does go up to that 1.5 degree level temporarily, if it then drops back down again?
Yeah, it's a good question because the Paris Agreement obviously has a long-term focus, and the temperature goal in the Paris Agreement is a long-term global goal. So if the temperature goes above 1.5 degrees as a global average temporarily, it doesn't mean that the Paris Agreement has failed. Its intention is to try to keep that long-term temperature average within those limits, hopefully less than 1.5 degrees, but certainly less than 2. The issue is, and the warning that we're getting now is that currently the global temperature in 2020 was already 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, so that's close to 1.5, and now, as you said in the introduction, our forecasts are that there's a growing chance that it could start to come up above 1.5 in the next 5 years.
Well, yes, and what are you learning about those longer-term averages? To what extent is the trend an upward one?
Well, the trend is clearly an upward one, and we see that just from the observational record. The warmest year on record was 2016. That was about 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial levels, but there was a strong El Nino event at the time, and that tends to give the temperature a little bit of a boost. But the last 5 years have been the warmest 5 years on record. The last decade was the warmest decade on record, and the decades successively before the current decade have all been the warmest decades on record to that point. So we see a clear upward trend, and unless something is done to control the emissions, that trend will certainly continue.
And how do you do your calculations?
Well, the product that has the current information that we're discussing now in it is a new product. It was developed under the leadership of the Met Office, acting as a lead center for annual to decadal forecasting, meaning that the lead center pulls together forecast information from the other global producing centers of these long-range forecasts. So to qualify as a forecast or a prediction, there has to be a skill assessment. It's not a projection, which is just running the science forward and seeing what the computer models suggest would happen. It's actually something that's verified by running it against historical data and seeing what the skill is. The skill for global average temperature is a very highly skillful prediction. So because it's a single number, it's not nearly as complicated to predict as something like local rainfall, which is something that's a lot more challenging.
Max Dilly, thanks very much indeed.
It's a pleasure.
In today's other climate news, the government's being urged to put plastic pollution on the agenda when it hosts next month's G7 summit. More than 30 business leaders, environmentalists and MPs want ministers to discuss a global treaty on plastics. They say 300 million tonnes of plastic waste is produced every year, while less than 10% of all plastic ever produced has been recycled. CO2 emissions from private jets have increased by nearly a third, rising faster than commercial planes. A new report by Transport and Environment shows carbon dioxide from private flights in Europe increased by 31% between 2005 and 2019. The campaign group says the UK is responsible for nearly a fifth of these emissions, making it the worst country in Europe for private jet pollution. A tortoise thought to have become extinct 100 years ago has been found alive on the Galapagos Islands. Scientists used genetic testing to confirm the female is part of a species known as the Fernandina giant tortoise. An expedition is now being planned to try and find other surviving members of the species. And an Australian court has ruled the government has a duty to protect young people from the climate crisis. 8 teenagers brought the case to court to stop the expansion of a coal mine in New South Wales. The judge stopped short of issuing an injunction, saying he was satisfied the Environment Minister wouldn't breach her duty of care. One of the teenagers involved, Anjali Sharma, said she sees today's result as a win.
The court has accepted the biggest part of our argument, which was that the Environment Minister owes us a duty of care. And now, while the court today didn't decide to grant an injunction, we have been granted an order, both parties, to come together and work out a way forward out of this. So while it might seem like we've won the battle but not the war is still going on, and the last part of this battle is still up for grabs.
And you can hear more from Anjali in this week's episode of Climate Cast. It's out tomorrow, wherever you normally get your podcasts from. Climate change impacts every single country in the world, but often we focus on the role of the big emitters, such as China and the United States. But smaller nations, such as Bahrain, have a role to play too. And in a moment, I'll be speaking to the country's Special Envoy for Climate Affairs. But first, let's take a closer look at the Gulf state. Well, Bahrain's position as a small island means it's impacted by climate change in a variety of ways. Firstly, rising sea levels. The highest point is 134 metres above sea level, with most of the coast no higher than 5 metres. And a mild estimate on sea level rise due to climate change predicts more than a quarter of the country could be underwater by the end of the century. Now, an increase in global temperature will also exacerbate the scarcity of usable water, placing Bahrain in the top 7 countries water-stressed by 2040. The country's economy relies on vast sums generated from oil refineries, but the government has applied for almost $10 million of assistance from the UN's Green Climate Fund. The country's carbon dioxide emissions have been stable for the last few years at around 22 tonnes of carbon dioxide per capita. Now, that puts it in the top 10 of all countries in the world in terms of CO2 emissions per person. Well, joining me now is Dr. Mohammed bin Dana, Special Envoy of Climate Change for the government of Bahrain. Hello to you. So as we heard there, Bahrain is at risk of suffering some of the worst effects of climate change. So how concerned are you, and what are you doing to mitigate against the effects?
We're actually thinking, as a small island developing states, on the adaptations with the climate change. We managed to look at the sea level rise. We developed a simulator that measures the impact of the sea level rise on our shores and our own infrastructures. We set up a target to 2050 of 0.5 meter, and we build up a resilience plan to adapt with the climate change up to this level. We managed also to work on developing a national adaptation investments plan, because the financing for the adaptation projects is very important and crucial.
Now, international climate activism has played a huge role in recent weeks, putting pressures on governments and corporations to meet their commitments on climate change. Bahrain has repeatedly stifled protest and activism. So can you guarantee that climate activists will be given freedom to speak out?
We in Bahrain have a very democratic institution, and we have the House of Parliament, and under the government, the freedom of speech is always available for everybody in Bahrain, not just the environmentalists.
Human rights groups would argue with that, of course. They would say that their freedom of speech is stifled.
They could argue as much as they want, but this is not actually the truth. The truth is everybody, as per the Constitution, has the right to speak in Bahrain.
OK, well, we will leave it there. Dr. Mohammed bin Dana, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, with holidays abroad off the cards for many this summer, British beaches are expected to be busier than ever. And a new campaign is hoping to keep our coastline clean by asking everyone who visits a beach to pick up 5 pieces of litter. Well, earlier I spoke to TV presenter and UN patron of the wilderness, Ben Fogle, and asked him why keeping beaches clean is so important.
You can see I'm on a beautiful beach here. I'm actually up on the Shetland Islands. And while we do have plenty of pristine beaches like this, you only need to turn the corner, find where the prevailing winds are, the prevailing currents, and it's a very different picture. There's a misconception that it's picnickers who go to the beach and just leave their rubbish behind. That's not really the case. It's stuff that has emptied into the ocean from rivers all around the world. It's stuff that's been lost or thrown off the back of ships and vessels. And I think we all have a responsibility to protect not just the beaches that we enjoy going to, but also the ocean.
Well, that's everything from us for today. On the Daily Climate Show tomorrow, how abandoned fishing nets littering the ocean are being transformed into PPE in Thailand. That's at the same time tomorrow here on Sky News. See you then.